The biting wind howled through the towering pines, rattling the windows of the small police outpost nestled at the edge of the forest. The officers inside were used to strange occurrences, runaway hikers, missing campers, even the occasional rogue animal. But nothing quite like this. It started as a soft, almost hesitant tap against the station's front door. Then another, and another. At first, Officer Daniels thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but when the knocking grew insistent, he exchanged a wary glance with his partner. "Who the hell knocks at a police station in the middle of the night?" murmured Officer Reed, reaching for his flashlight. When Daniels swung open the heavy wooden door, the last thing he expected to see was a massive, shaggy figure standing on two legs. A bear, not charging, not growling, just waiting. The beast's dark eyes glistened with something that sent a shiver down the officer's spine. It wasn't aggression or hunger. It was something deeper. And then, as if pleading, the bear turned and lumbered back into the darkness. It wanted them to follow. With a mixture of hesitation and curiosity, the officers exchanged glances before stepping out into the freezing night. They had no idea that what they were about to find would leave them speechless and shatter everything they thought they knew about the wild. The officers hesitated for only a moment before stepping out into the cold, the bear's massive silhouette barely visible as it trudged ahead. Officer Daniels tightened his grip on his flashlight, the beam flickering across the snowy ground, revealing paw prints deep enough to indicate the animal's sheer weight. "Daniels, are we really following a bear?" Reed muttered under his breath, his hand hovering over his holstered firearm. "Something's not right," Daniels whispered back. "Bears don't knock on doors, and they sure as hell don't ask for help." The bear moved with purpose, glancing back every few paces to make sure they were still behind him. It wasn't the erratic behavior of an injured or desperate animal. It was something else, something almost deliberate. The officers exchanged one last wary glance before pushing deeper into the forest. The night swallowed them, the trees creaking under the weight of the wind. After what felt like an eternity, the bear finally stopped. And that's when they saw it. At the base of a jagged rock formation, partially buried beneath a tangle of broken branches, lay another bear. A smaller one. It wasn't moving. Daniel's breath hitched. "Oh my God!" The larger bear, now clearly a mother, let out a deep, guttural sound. It wasn't a growl or a warning. It was something else, a plea. Reed swallowed hard, stepping closer. She brought us here to help?" The injured bear's fur was matted with blood, a jagged gash running along its flank. Claw marks. It had been attacked, possibly by another bear or maybe even a mountain lion. The mother nudged the smaller bear's head gently with her massive snout, as if urging him to wake up. But he didn't. Daniels knelt beside the injured cub, careful not to startle the mother. He could see the shallow rise and fall of its chest, still alive. "Barely. We need to call the wildlife rescue," Daniels said, pulling out his radio. Reed, still struggling to process what they were witnessing, let out a breathless laugh. "I can't believe this. A bear, an actual bear, came to us for help, but as they worked to call in assistance, the mother bear did something that would haunt them forever." She lowered herself to the ground, resting her head beside her cubs. And then, slowly, she reached out one massive paw, gently covering the cub's body, as if trying to shield him from the cold, from harm, from death itself. The gesture was so heartbreakingly human that neither officer could speak. Bears were powerful, territorial, unpredictable. But this was love. This was something the world wasn't ready to believe. The cold bit into Officer Daniel's skin as he knelt beside the injured bear cub, his breath forming shallow clouds in the freezing night air. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from something far deeper, an emotion he couldn't quite name. Disbelief? Awe? Beside him, Reed stood motionless, his hand still resting on his holstered weapon, though they both knew by now there was no need for it. The mother bear had done nothing to threaten them, only to lead them here, to show them this. Daniel's flashlight trembled slightly in his grip as he took in the sight before him. The mother bear, a hulking mass of fur and muscle, was curled around her cub in a way that was almost too gentle for a creature of her size and strength. Her massive paw remained draped over the young bear's body, as though she could will warmth and safety into him through sheer presence alone. It was a sight that defied everything they knew about the animal kingdom. Bears didn't seek out humans, and they certainly didn't beg. The realization sent a shiver down Daniel's spine, though not from the cold. She knew. She knew they could help. Reed finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniels, how the hell is this happening? Daniel swallowed hard, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene. I don't know. The mother bear lifted her head slightly at the sound of their voices, her dark, intelligent eyes locking onto Daniel's. He had seen animals before, countless deer, mountain lions, even the occasional lost wolf pup. He had always believed that while animals had instincts, they lacked true understanding. They weren't like humans. They didn't feel the way people did. But this bear was looking at him the way a mother would. The way his own mother had, when he'd fallen from his bike as a kid and she'd rushed to his side. The way a firefighter looks at a trapped child, or the way a medic stares down at a wounded soldier. The way someone who refuses to give up looks at the only person who might be able to help. A deep ache settled in Daniel's chest. His breath felt shallow, tight. His fingers curled against his knee as he struggled to make sense of it all. The wind howled through the trees, rustling the brittle branches overhead. The cub let out a faint, pained whimper, and the mother let out a sound in response, a soft, rumbling croon. Not a growl, not a snarl, but a sound that, had it come from a human, would have been unmistakable. A lullaby. Daniels felt something sting his eyes. He blinked rapidly, looking away, trying to gather himself. Reed cleared his throat, rubbing his arms. I radioed for the wildlife rescue team. They're sending someone out, but it might take a while in this weather. Daniels nodded absently. His gaze returned to the mother bear. She hadn't moved. She barely seemed to breathe, her focus entirely on the fragile life beneath her paw. She didn't know where else to go, Daniels murmured. Reed turned to him. What? Daniels finally stood, exhaling sharply. She didn't know where else to go. He repeated, more firmly this time. She's a bear, Reed. But she knocked. She waited. She brought us here. Because she knows. Somehow. She knows we're the only ones who can help. Reed shook his head. It doesn't make sense. How could she possibly? I don't know, Daniels admitted. His voice cracked slightly, and he clenched his jaw. But I know what I'm seeing. And so do you. They both turned back toward the bears. The mother bear blinked slowly at them, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. She was tired. She was scared. And yet, she still hadn't left her cub's side. Daniels took a slow, careful step closer, his breath coming in short, shaky exhales. The mother bear didn't move. A predator, an animal that could have ripped him apart in an instant, let him. Daniels knelt beside the cub again, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached out a tentative hand and touched the young bear's side. His fur was coarse, his body unnervingly still. But he was warm, barely. Daniel's throat tightened. The cub's breathing was shallow, weak. They were running out of time. He looked up at the mother, his voice low and steady. We're going to help him. I promise. The mother bear let out a low, weary exhale. She didn't understand his words. But somehow, deep down, Daniels felt she understood him. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Daniels knelt beside the cub, listening to its fragile breaths. The mother bear hadn't moved, her enormous frame still curled protectively around her child. The only sound was the whisper of the wind and the occasional crack of frozen branches in the distance. Reed paced anxiously behind him, his boots crunching against the snow. How much longer for that rescue team? Daniels checked his radio. They're still at least 20 minutes out. He swallowed hard. I don't know if he has that long. The thought made his chest tighten. They were human. They had tools, knowledge, resources. And yet, despite everything, he felt helpless. The mother bear had come to them, had placed her trust in them, and now her cub's life hung in the balance. He glanced up at her again. She was watching him closely, her dark eyes unwavering. She knows. The words echoed in his mind like a revelation. She wasn't just acting on instinct. This wasn't some desperate, random act of a wild animal. She understood. Daniels wasn't sure he'd ever understand how, but it was undeniable. This bear, this mother, had recognized something in them. Something beyond species. Something human. His gaze drifted back to the cub. Its fur rose and fell in shallow waves, too weak to move. Without medical intervention, the chances of survival were slipping away by the second. Daniels inhaled sharply, his hands tightening into fists. "We can't wait." Reed frowned. "What are you talking about? We have to do something now." Reed hesitated. "Daniels, we're not vets. We can't." "I know." Daniels' voice was firm, but there was a raw edge to it. "But I can't just sit here and watch him die." He turned back toward the mother bear and did something that, by every measure of logic and survival, should have been unthinkable. He reached out, slowly, carefully, with every ounce of gentleness he had. The mother bear tensed, but didn't move. His fingertips brushed the cub's fur. It was ice cold, too cold. Hypothermia. The thought clicked into place in his mind, along with something he'd once read, something about treating hypothermia in wildlife. Daniels took a deep breath and, with deliberate care, shrugged off his thick police-issued jacket. Without hesitation, he wrapped it around the cub, cocooning its tiny body in the insulated fabric. Then, ignoring every instinct screaming at him, he lifted the cub from the snow. The mother bear let out a low, vibrating sound, not aggressive, but uncertain. Daniel's heart pounded. He met her gaze. "I know," he murmured. "I know you're scared." Her massive head tilted slightly, as if studying him. "I'm not taking him away," Daniels continued, his voice softer now. "I just need to keep him warm until help gets here." For several agonizing seconds, no one moved. Then, the mother did something that made Daniel's breath hitch. She leaned forward, slowly, cautiously, and pressed her nose gently against his arm. Daniels froze, his pulse roaring in his ears. The warmth of her breath ghosted against his skin. It was a moment of absolute trust, a silent agreement between them. Daniels exhaled, steadying himself. Carefully, he shifted the cub in his arms, keeping the jacket wrapped tightly around its body. The little bear barely stirred, but its breathing felt just a little steadier, a little stronger. The mother bear watched his every move, but made no attempt to stop him. Reed, still wide-eyed, let out a shaky laugh. "I can't believe this." Daniels managed a small smile. "Neither can I." Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens cut through the silence, and headlights flashed through the trees. The rescue team had arrived. As the medics approached, Daniels reluctantly handed the cub over, watching as they carefully placed him inside a transport carrier. The mother bear let out a low, anxious sound, but Daniels turned to her, speaking as if she could understand. "He's in good hands." She didn't move, didn't try to attack or flee. She simply watched. Daniels stepped back, letting the rescue team do their work. He felt something shift inside him, something profound. He had spent his life believing in the divide between humans and animals, that there was an instinctual, unbreakable barrier between their worlds. But tonight, that belief had shattered, because he had seen it in her eyes. Understanding, empathy, hope. And as the team prepared to transport the cub to safety, Daniels turned back one last time, only to find the mother bear still watching him. Then, without hesitation, she did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She nodded, a slow, deliberate dip of her massive head, acknowledgement. Then, with one last lingering glance at the carrier holding her cub, she turned and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Daniel stood frozen, watching her go, feeling an overwhelming weight settle in his chest. Reed exhaled beside him. "Did she just thank you?" Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Yeah," he whispered. "I think she did." And in that moment, he knew, without a doubt, that he would never see the world the same way again. The days that followed were a whirlwind of reports, interviews, and endless questions that Daniels himself was still struggling to answer. The young bear had survived, thanks to immediate intervention, and was being monitored at a wildlife rehabilitation center. But the real story, the one that sent shockwaves through scientific communities and conservation circles, was the mother's behavior. Daniel sat in his office, staring at the untouched coffee on his desk. The police station had been flooded with calls from researchers, journalists, and even government officials. Some wanted confirmation, others wanted explanations, but the truth was, he had none. Animals weren't supposed to act like that. Bears weren't supposed to seek out human help. They weren't supposed to display what looked undeniably like trust or gratitude. They weren't supposed to understand. And yet, she had. Daniel sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. He had spent his entire career seeing the natural world as something separate, something untamed and ruled by instinct. Humans were the observers, the protectors, the ones who imposed order. But what if they had it wrong? What if the barriers between humans and animals weren't as solid as they thought? What if they weren't so different after all? The sound of his inbox pinging brought him back to reality. He glanced at the email subject line. Urgent. Behavioral study proposal. Case of unprecedented Earth-human interaction. Scientists from a leading university wanted to launch a study based on his report. They believed this case could reshape understanding of animal cognition, perhaps even challenge long-held theories about the emotional depth of wildlife. Daniels exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of it all. Policy discussions had already begun. If bears or other large predators were capable of seeking human aid, should conservation efforts change? Should wildlife agencies adjust their protocols? And what about the public? Would they see bears differently now? For Daniels, the transformation was more personal. He had spent years seeing animals as statistics, population counts, migration patterns, risks to public safety. But after that night, he could no longer look at a bear and see just a bear. He saw a mother, a desperate plea, a choice to trust, and it changed everything. He didn't know where this would lead, whether his story would be embraced or dismissed as an anomaly. But one thing was certain, he would never again underestimate the depth of the wild. And as he glanced at the framed photo on his desk, the grainy image of a massive bear watching over her injured cub, he made a quiet promise. He would spend the rest of his life proving to the world that she had understood, that she had known, that maybe, just maybe, the wild had been trying to talk to them all along. Months passed, but the night with the bear never left Daniels. It had carved itself into his memory, reshaped his beliefs, and set in motion a movement he never expected to be part of. The scientific community had taken notice. Researchers began re-examining long-held assumptions about animal cognition and emotional intelligence. Conservationists pushed for new approaches to human-wildlife interactions, arguing that creatures long thought to be ruled only by instinct might possess something far deeper, an awareness, a capacity for trust, perhaps even an unspoken language of their own. The story spread beyond scientific circles. News outlets covered it. Wildlife documentaries explored it. Schools discussed it in classrooms, inspiring young minds to reconsider the way they saw the natural world. But for Daniels, the change was most profound on a personal level. He no longer saw his job as just enforcing laws and protecting people from wildlife encounters. He saw it as bridging something, building an understanding between two worlds that had always been seen as separate. He attended conservation meetings, spoke with biologists, even assisted in new policy discussions that emphasized coexistence rather than conflict. Most importantly, he visited the young bear, now strong, healthy, and nearing the day he would return to the wild. The rehabilitation team had decided to release him near his original territory, in hopes that his mother would find him. Daniels knew that if she was anything like she had been that night, she would. On the day of the cub's release, Daniels stood at the edge of the forest, watching as the transport team carefully opened the crate. The young bear hesitated for only a moment before stepping out, his nose twitching as he sniffed the crisp mountain air. Then, without looking back, he disappeared into the trees. Daniels let out a slow breath, his chest tight with emotion. He didn't know if he would ever see the mother bear again. But somehow, he felt certain she was out there, watching, waiting, hoping. And maybe, just maybe, she would remember. As Daniels turned to leave, he glanced up at the sky, where a single hawk soared high above the treetops. A small smile tugged at his lips. The wild had always been something humans feared, controlled, and studied from a distance. But now, he knew better. It was something to listen to learn from, and most of all, to respect. For the first time in his life, Daniels didn't see the wilderness as something separate from himself. He saw it as something he was a part of, something that had been speaking all along, just waiting for someone to hear. And now, at last, he was listening,